In 1881, the Government of Canada constitutes the Canadian Pacific Railway, signing a contract with the four men who formed what was called the Syndicate: George Stephen, Donald Smith, Donald Forbes Angus, and Mr. McIntyre. These men are going to build the Transcontinental Railway for Canada from near North Bay, Ontario, all the way out to Vancouver. Now, with a terminus in North Bay, it was rather removed from the center of industry in Canada, so the syndicate sets out to expand the rail line from North Bay downwards to Montreal and into southwestern Ontario. In 1881, they moved to acquire the St. Lawrence and Ottawa Railway to give them the link down to the United States. This is contested by the Grand Trunk, which has been running the St. Lawrence and Ottawa since the reorganization of 1865. The situation remains in the hands of the bondholders, who are going to have to vote to settle which company is actually going to take it over. And then finally, in 1884, this is decided that CP will actually become the owner of the St. Lawrence and Ottawa. Now, as they take over the St. Lawrence and Ottawa, they've already have taken over a competing rail line that came to Brockville, the Central Canada Railway, Brockville and Ottawa Railway. They take this over in 1881. So they now have two lines that reach the St. Lawrence River. They actually favor the use of the Brockville and Ottawa over the St. Lawrence and Ottawa and make moves to reduce the service going through Prescott drastically. They move the shops from there to Carleton Place. They reduce the frequency of service over the line. They cause a large community outcry in Prescott over this situation. So CP now owns these two lines that come down to the river. There's also two competing ferry services on the river to link Brockville to Morristown, New York, Prescott, of course, to Ogdensburg. And in the mid-1800s, it's decided that they're actually going to try to consolidate the ferry service, because the railway system on the American side that served both Morristown and Ogdensburg has all been consolidated into one company called the Rome, Watertown and Ogdensburg Railway. And in 1888, Canadian Pacific Car and Passenger Transfer Company is established that consolidates the competing ferry interests on the river into one company. And while they do maintain service to Brockville, it's only seasonal, shuts down in the winter. Prescott, Ogdensburg becomes the year-round operating point because it's much easier to keep the channel clear of ice in the wintertime between the 2 points. Brockville Star fades in the CP network. It becomes basically a branch line, while Prescott becomes more of a mainline center with trains shuttling back and forth to connect with the Rome, Watertown and Ogdensburg, which in turn connects to the New York Central, which brings traffic down to New York City. Now in 1892, the New York Central takes over the Rome, Watertown and Ogdensburg, and now it meets directly with Canadian Pacific, and the two cooperate on handling freight traffic, the most famous being the Silk Train.
In 1895, the town of Prescott built a new grain elevator at the east end of the town and just directly west of the CPR train station. The CPR decided to build a spur line that ran from the yards over here to Water Street and then continued all the way along Water Street to the Dominion Lighthouse Depot. And it would have gone past the grain elevator and had a separate spur line into the grain elevator as well. The steamboats that plied the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes also docked at the site of the CPR station, and so that facilitated the exchange of passengers from boats to trains and vice versa, and also some freight that went on those boats. And it was a very busy scene at the harbor, starting and continuing from that period on.
There used to be a train probably every day coming from Ottawa. It would be filled, and they would go on trips either to Toronto, or I think most of them came to shoot the rapids on the Rapid Prince.
Yeah, no, the Rapid Prince was a day trip. They would leave early in the morning around 9 o'clock and arrive in Montreal at 6. So I guess that train must have come in a bit earlier in the morning, did it, from Ottawa? to hook up with the train?
Yes.
That
And
would
then,
go?
and then I think there was train service every morning about 7 o'clock that would go to Ottawa,
Yeah.
and then come back in about 8 o'clock at night.
This is an old ledger in our collection. You can see it's a very dated document, and it appears to have been somewhat singed by fire, but it's come down through the years. And it's a ledger that was kept by the Canadian Pacific Car and Passenger Transfer Company. And that's quite a handle. What that company was the operation that operated the ferry boats to carry the rail cars across from Prescott to Ogdensburg and in the other direction. And this one is dated 1929. It was taken over by the CPR the following year, in 1930.
Now, the silk trains carried silk from the Orient, from Japan and China, through to New York City, which was a major silk processing center. There was huge competition by the American railroads that reached the West Coast. We had the Union Pacific, we had the Northern Pacific, and the Santa Fe, all serving the West Coast, trying to capture this silk traffic because it was a very, very profitable traffic. You could have a train of about 9 cars in length. The product was worth $1 million in dollars of the 1880s, and it had to move on an expedited schedule because insurance rates were set fabulously high for the time the product was in transport. So CP competed with these lines, and because CP had their own steamboats across the Pacific Ocean from 1891 onwards, they had a good grasp on the traffic, and by 1892 they were hauling about 20% of the total traffic coming out of Japan and China to New York City. For the silk trade, they also were a huge company for moving tea from these countries. So it helped actually stabilize the Canadian Pacific. At the time, the West has not been settled. CP is trying to encourage settlement in the West. They're losing money on every train that goes through the Rocky Mountains because it's very expensive territory to go through with very, very little traffic. So this traffic was very, very important to CP. Because CP was an integrated system operating both the steamboats across the Pacific and had a transcontinental line, which the American carriers did not. The Americans had to use at least 2, if not 3 railways to go from the Pacific coast to New York, whereas CP would get them all the way to Prescott before they would have to hand off the traffic. They were able to have this extra leg up to capture it. Now, silk remained a valuable commodity until the rise of synthetic fabrics in the early 1930s. The last silk train that I can find reference of crossing the river on the ferry was in 1935. There were a couple of isolated shipments of 1 or 2 cars after that, but basically by World War II, the silk traffic has disappeared.
When they got to Prescott, the silk was inspected in the rail cars to make sure that everything was all right, that nothing had gone amiss, and that because of the value of them, they had to enter the values and the quantities in documents at the dock before they went across the river and went out of the control of the CPR. My great uncle Ed McNally, back in the early 1900s, was one of the agents employed for a number of years to make those inspections. He was a young man at that time, in his early 20s, and that was quite a responsibility, really, for a young man to be charged with ensuring that these multi-million-dollar shipments were processed efficiently and safely and securely.
If the train was going to show up at 3 o'clock in the morning, they had to go down to meet the train to expedite it, even though they were working basically a regular day's shift then. It was like 9 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the afternoon, but you'd have to come out specially to handle these trains because they could not be delayed. So it was a major undertaking, and because again of these super high insurance rates they had, CP wants to get this train off its tracks as quickly as it can, so the burden is then passed on to the New York Central to move it.
In a sense, it was during that period that Prescott became known as a railway town. But of course, there was a lot more to Prescott than just railways. It was a manufacturing town of some note. It developed one of the largest distilleries in Eastern Canada, the J.P. Weiser whiskey distillery. It had a branch of the Labatt brewery in town, operated by a Robert Labatt. And there were a number of other important businesses that manufactured and shipped their goods across Canada, taking advantage of the wonderful railway connections that existed in the town.
The railways worked on wood-fired locomotives until the latter part of the 1870s. Wood was very plentiful, there were large forests, and it was also a boon to the local settlers in the region because they would cut down trees to clear farmland and they'd be able to sell the timber to the railways as fuel for locomotives. So it helped with settlement of the area and gave the railways the source of fuel they needed. Ontario has never had coal industry in it. So coal is a foreign product that has to be imported, so it's much more expensive than using wood. However, by the early 1870s, the Grand Trunk is already making noises that it's having trouble securing adequate supplies of wood for its locomotives. There's 1878, we know that the St. Lawrence in Ottawa converts its first locomotive to burn coal, and certainly the Grand Trunk is burning coal very shortly thereafter. So coal has to be imported. It comes from coal mines in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio. These are brought up to the lakes, dumped into barges and boats, brought up the river, ports where it's taken off and then moved by the railways to where it's necessary. CP is the largest use of the coal that comes through the port of Ogdensburg, and that's going to remain that way until the end of the steam-powered locomotive. CP is faced with a need to expand its yards in Prescott. In 1906, the George Hall Company decides to consolidate its Canadian coal operations, which had been split between Brockville and Prescott, to Prescott. So they build a huge new coal hoist and coal yard in Prescott, and they're going to handle about 300,000 tons of coal a year through Prescott to service the industries and the Canadian Pacific Railway requirements in Eastern Ontario. That means they fill in a lot of the boggy spots that exist along the shoreline, lay new freight car tracks in the yard. They move the station up towards the main, or King Street. So that's what happened with the station. Now in 1912, there's a huge fire which destroys the old freight shed down by the river. And that is the fire that people talk about. And this was a very large building that probably went back to, at least part of it, to the early days of the Bytown in Prescott.
New coal yards were constructed at the waterfront in Prescott in the 1950s. But the days for coal were starting to come to an end as it was being displaced by diesel, both in ships and in rail locomotives. And eventually the coal yards were closed down.
It was a busy port. The Valley Camp, the Coal Haven, always came in about every other day. They go, I think it was DeSoto, they get their load of coal and they bring it to Prescott. Trains back then burnt coal, and it was kind of a smoky area. And some of the houses on Fort Hill got pretty dirty.
The train station would have been around ahead of here, and the roundhouse would have been up here. So here we have some unidentified cement construction, obviously footings or parts of buildings laying in the grass here right in front of Fort Wellington. They're not identified, but they're obviously part of the old CPR stockyards. There used to be many buildings here, and so these have just been left here as a silent reminder of when the railway was here. This is a plaque installed by Parks Canada which depicts the old CPR rail yards at Prescott opposite Ogdensburg, And it just tells a bit of the story of the rail link between Ottawa and the traffic that came down here. It talks about the ferry terminal. The pilings out in the water are what's left of the old wharf that the rail cars went onto ferries and then were transported across the river to Ogdensburg. Included in the depiction is a schematic of the different rail lines, and you can see rail cars on some of these lines and how they were configured. You can see some of the buildings along the waterfront. You can see the station, and here's a photograph of the station from the west side, and you can see the docks here running out, and here's some rail cars that would have been lined up on the different sidings. And today it's all a park maintained by Parks Canada, and it's in front of historic Fort Wellington, which is right behind us.